Good morning. As we've been saying, it's really powerful to be with all of you today. When we yelled Mazel Tov, I felt the heat from my face holding back the tears. The grooms, who were dressed in tuxedo t-shirts, were nestled in the hospice bed. Guests stood at the corners, holding a large talit above them. The ceremony ended as they broke a glass on the hospital tray using a book. I pushed through singing Siman Tov as I noticed their arms tightly gripped around one another like a seatbelt trying to prevent what would be the inevitable crash that would happen only weeks later. Jonathan, not yet 29, was dying from advanced stages of AIDS. Barely recognizable from the man that I had met at ACT UP, the AIDS Coalition to Unleash Power. He had been a brilliant activist whose passion had been unceasing. I chose to beg off as they served the champagne, wondering how can they celebrate? For you see, at 25, I had already amassed a long list of friends claimed by the HIV/AIDS pandemic. And now I was officiating my first same-sex ceremony as a rabbinical student in a hospice. Things felt torn asunder, as if shattering the glass was the most truthful act, belying the weighty questions that were just beneath the surface. How does one live in the face of so much brokenness? Later that evening, my roommate, a fellow HIV activist, a social worker, could tell that there was something wrong. And so I laid bare my despair before him. Officiating a wedding for a dying friend felt simply absurd. As my cynicism, anger, and grief poured forth, he reflected, "Josh, don't they deserve happiness? What if officiating their commitment ceremony was their lifeline?" I thought, how could this be? Even in a hospice, I said, he is dying. How is that helpful? And he replied, "Josh, everyone deserves to have joy in the face of tragedy. Who are you to deny them that? Remember what Harvey Milk said, you gotta give them hope." In a similar way, we have spent 6 months dislocated, disoriented, and sometimes feeling broken. A funeral on Zoom is not so different from a wedding in a hospice. Different pandemics, different consequences, familiar territory. Despair, isolation, and questioning the utility of things like virtual High Holy Day services or life cycles that now feel so different from what we had imagined. In confronting our broken reality, we can succumb to despair, or we can discover, explore, and claim what are the pieces that we can bring back together. I believe this is where hope comes in. But I have to disagree with Harvey Milk. Hope is not best thought of as a gift that someone can give to another. I believe instead offering hope is like removing a sheet from a mirror after shivah, inviting people to see new possibilities. Choosing life in the face of death is Judaism's defiant hope. Choosing life in the face of death is Judaism's defiant hope. For too long, there has been an understanding of hope that is passive, likely coming from its etymology, which implies trust in an intervening and rescuing God. While often there are unseen forces at work that can shift our circumstance with grace, I do not think that we should ever depend on that happening. When we do that, we submissively wait for external things. for external things to change, like a vaccine or a different elected official to lead, before we go about living life the best way we know how, or taking upon ourselves to make the necessary changes so that those things that we want to see in the world can happen. Sometimes the most important thing is to surrender to the reality, but rarely does that render us inert with no options. Instead, to have hope, to have true hope, is to be courageous. Psalm 27, a psalm that Jewish traditions offers as a preparation for the new year that we began this morning with, contains these words in its closing. Strengthen your heart with courage and hope. Tradition wisely teaches that a new year won't solve our problems, but we can cultivate strength to address the challenges that we are facing and garner the courage to face the uncertainty of a year ahead. This makes hope an active process, not a romantic notion. This is the kind of hope I can get behind. We must have the humility to accept that we are rarely the entire solution, but also the daring to act as if a part of the redemption relies upon us. This understanding is precisely why Rabbi Jonathan Sacks makes a distinction between optimism and hope. Optimism, he says, is the belief that things are going to get better. Hope is the belief that together we can make things better. Optimism is a passive virtue. Hope is an active one, he says. Hope carries a considerable price because it demands disruption and an end to our complacency. He points to the Hebrew prophets as our prime example because they refused to be comforted until the hopeful outcome had been reached. They are the ones who were willing to disorient, to dislocate, to create a sense of discomfort until people would act. That is hope. On one hand, he says that it is challenging to be Jewish and be an optimist because we have our own history of persecution, and yet he credits our survival to responding to such suffering with the refusal to give up hope. He believes that has been our gift as a people, and it is what we, I believe, need to rely upon now. Hope, then, perhaps is a Jewish spiritual practice born out of our suffering. Brené Brown studied hope, and she started with the hypothesis that hopeful people had easier lives, more resources. But after examining copious data on hope, she could not find a single example of moral courage or of spiritual courage that was not born completely of vulnerability. What she found was that people who lived with a sense of their own worthiness, they lived with hope-filled and wholehearted lives. They understood their worthiness, and they concluded, like Sacks, that hope is born from struggle and embraced with courage. People who had less guarantees in life, who were not trapped by perfectionism or the need for certainty, but rather they understood that risks were essential, were the ones who were making the choices to lead hope-filled lives. It led her to wonder if our capacity for wholeheartedness can never be greater than our willingness to be brokenhearted. And if that question is true, it explains the spiritual paradox that we often talk about at the High Holy Days, uttered by Rabbi Mendel of Kotsk. There is nothing so whole as a broken heart. We may know that today. We may feel that. So who among us has not been brokenhearted in this past season? Arriving at New Year's invites us to attend to our hearts and to realign our focus onto shivah, the hopeful idea that there can be repair, and that we are endowed with the possibility of being agents of such repair. Brown's research also points to why engaging in this kind of repair is hopeful, as she highlights the work of social scientist C.R. Snyder. He also makes a distinction between optimism and hope. He says optimism is a feeling, where hope is a thought process that consists of three parts. First, setting goals that envision the course we will take. We must set goals, discerning how to achieve those goals with the possibility of adapting and charting alternative paths when obstacles arise. We set our goals. We then discern what's possible with those goals, being flexible to new directions. And thirdly, the thought process of believing in ourselves and our abilities. And the best news is Snyder believed that this kind of hope mindset was teachable and learnable. This sounds exactly like the kind of tools that a congregation such as ours would work to cultivate, especially in the face of climate collapse, of systemic racial injustice, of shifts towards fascism in this country and white supremacy. Facing all of this can easily turn into despair, to paralysis, or to hopelessness. And as I said earlier, succumbing to despair is understandable, but know that it is nothing less than nihilism. So instead, we must lean, I urge you, into our Jewish spiritual tradition and history that has endowed humanity to be partners in continuing creation. We have reason to grieve, but that does not bar us from embracing an act of hope. I believe we must do both. On March 13th, just before we stopped having services at Beit Haverim in person, I wrote to our community, "This is the moment that we have been created for. As an LGBTQ-founded congregation, we have lived through times of oppression with resilience and resistance. We created a Jewish spiritual home in a time when doors were closed to us. We could have responded with despair or anger, but instead we created sanctuary. And then shortly after, we lived with the specter of AIDS, where our synagogue and other queer Jews were further marginalized. Many of our loved ones suffered, some of them died, but we offered dignity, witness, and community. We did not do this without grieving, yet we kept moving forward, attracting other renegade and courageous souls of all orientations, seeking authenticity, justice, and sanctuary. This is the soil from which we have emerged." When I look back on that writing, what I realize now is that I was pointing to that the very foundation of the origin of our synagogue was nothing less than defiant hope. We are a living example of what it means to choose life in the face of death and despair. Author and purveyor of hope, Rebecca Solnit, in her book, Hope in Dark Times, writes, "Hope is a belief that what we do might matter, and that understanding the future is not yet written. It is an informed open-mindedness about what can happen and what role we might play in it." Isn't this the mindset that we need to adopt as we enter into this new year? Each of us, and as a community, standing before the unwritten Sefer Chaim, the book of life, we must know that what we do and choose matters, trusting that together, that boundedness of that rope we create, that we can persevere. We have defied the odds. We have done it before. This is not the moment to shy away from anything less. Our future is not yet penned, and it certainly is not yet sealed. So what we do is essential. What role will you play? When I look back at that first commitment ceremony, I believe that Jonathan revealed to me that there are no limits on choosing hope. Until our very last breath, we can practice hope. and understand that the future is not yet written and that what we do can help shape the course of history. I now understand how despair was not useful as a response at my friend's commitment ceremony. And I believe that despair is not a useful option for us in this coming year. Even after the news of Justice Bader Ginsburg's death last night, I do not believe that we can fall into a place of despair. She certainly would urge us to take on her legacy and to continue to fight for the equality of all. So no matter what this year holds, we do not know what it looks like. We are in a place of uncertainty. And so I beg you, I plead with you, won't you choose to practice hope with me in this coming year? Shana Tova.